Hey guys, tonight we step into a world where something you take for granted, soap, was once a luxury so costly and so controlled that you might only see a bar of it a few times in your entire life. Imagine you're trudging down a cobblestone street in early modern Europe, and the air is thick not only with smoke from wood fires, but also with the unmistakable funk of bodies that haven't touched soap in weeks, maybe months. A bar of soap wasn't just a household item. It was a status symbol, taxed by rulers, restricted by guilds, and whispered about like some kind of magical object. You probably won't survive this trip without wrinkling your nose more than once. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle into a cramped kitchen where a bar of soap sits locked in a small wooden chest. The family doesn't leave it out, because frankly, it's more valuable than half the cutlery. Early soap in Europe wasn't the bright, bubbly delight you know. It was rough, often lumpy, made from animal fat and ashes, and smelled faintly of rancid tallow. Yet, with taxes slapped on it by governments eager to squeeze revenue from every household necessity, it became something only the well-off could use regularly. Common folk would ration it. One wash for clothes here, a rare body scrub there, always stretching its lifespan like it was some medieval gold bar. You notice the irony. Soap had been around for centuries. Ancient Babylonians made it. Romans used versions of it in their bathhouses. And in the Islamic world, soap making was refined into an actual art form. But in Christian Europe during the late Middle Ages, when public bathing fell out of favor, soap suddenly became both more important and more inaccessible. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate control mechanism by rulers, taxing a basic good because they could, or if it was just the easiest way to fill treasury coffers in a world where everyone was desperate to fund wars. Either way, your skin is itching just thinking about how rare a clean wash really was. You pause at a market stall where soap is displayed like jewelry, each bar wrapped in cloth and stamped with seals of authenticity. Imagine walking past racks of bread and fish, then seeing a bar of soap tagged at nearly the same price. Merchants brag about the origins, Marseille, Castile, Venice, like fine wine labels today. You chuckle when one stallholder insists his soap was cured under the blessings of the sea breeze, which is marketing speak for, we left it on a windowsill until it hardened. Of course, there's always someone trying to cut corners. Just as modern companies water down products, you spot soap sellers who sneak in chalk or clay to bulk out the bars. Customers grumble but pay anyway, because what's the alternative? Go without. Some do, and they smell like it. Others save their pennies to buy just one fragrant bar, cutting off tiny shavings to stretch it across months. You picture yourself scraping a sliver thinner than a fingernail and thinking, that has to be enough for the week. The funny part is that governments treated soap taxes as serious business. In England, for example, soap was taxed so heavily by the 17th century that only licensed manufacturers could make it. Smugglers thrived, slipping untaxed soap through ports like it was contraband brandy. Officials set up patrols to sniff out illegal workshops, and you imagine a guard barging in, only to freeze at the smell of boiled lye and fat. Not exactly glamorous, but profitable enough to make it worth the risk. Meanwhile, across the channel, French aristocrats were parading their imported soaps as proof of refinement. Picture a powdered wig scratching at the scalp, a velvet sleeve brushing past a perfumed block of soap, and a noble boasting, "Oh yes, I only wash with olive oil soap from Castile." You roll your eyes, because if you're bathing once a season, does it matter where your soap comes from? Still, appearances were everything. You hear a quirky tidbit whispered in a tavern. Some people honestly believed soap could harm you if misused. Too much washing, they thought, weakened the body, stripped away vital oils, and made you vulnerable to disease. So, in a strange twist, people treated soap as both a luxury and a potential health hazard, like some medieval version of energy drinks today. You imagined someone warning, "Careful with that bar. One scrub too many, and you'll catch your death." The irony deepens when you remember how often plagues swept through Europe. Fleas, rats, bad sanitation, you name it. You'd think cleanliness would be embraced as salvation. Yet here you are, in a world where rulers tax soap out of reach, the church mutters about vanity and excessive washing, and ordinary folks balance between superstition and desperation. It's a perfect recipe for grime to linger. As you drift through this world of rationed bubbles, you catch sight of a mother carefully scrubbing her baby with lukewarm water and the tiniest pinch of soap, rubbing gently as if afraid to waste even a crumb. Around her, neighbors wrinkle their noses but stare in envy, knowing they can't afford such luxury. The soap dries quickly, tucked back into its chest, waiting weeks before it will be touched again. You realize soap wasn't just about hygiene, it was about identity, wealth, and power. If you smelled of rose oil and soap, you were someone. If you didn't, you blended into the sweaty crowd of laborers and peasants. Cleanliness became a class marker long before perfume commercials told you it did. And as you fade deeper into this journey, you begin to notice that the story of soap is really a story of control, of rulers squeezing revenue, of merchants inflating prestige, and of ordinary people finding scraps of cleanliness wherever they could. And you, trudging along those damp streets, can't help but laugh softly to yourself. The bar of soap in your bathroom today could have been a family heirloom back then. You step out of that cramped kitchen, still half amused and half disgusted at how precious soap felt, and wander through a town square where the sound of dripping water once echoed from grand Roman-style bathhouses. But now, centuries after the empire's collapse, those stone halls stand abandoned or converted into warehouses, chapels, or just ruins where children toss pebbles. Public bathing has gone from a celebrated ritual to a suspicious pastime, the kind you side-eye the way you might view a dodgy massage parlor in a dark alley. You pause in front of one ruined building, tracing the outlines of old mosaics. Once, this was a place of warmth, chatter, and steam, where neighbors discussed politics, ate snacks, and soaked in hot pools. Imagine the scent of oils, the sound of laughter bouncing off marble walls, the hush as water rippled across candlelit tiles. Now, all you hear is the squeak of rats, and the air smells faintly of mildew. A local mutters that bathing regularly is dangerous, that it weakens your constitution. You smirk. Clearly, this guy hasn't tried sitting through summer without deodorant. Still, you start noticing a pattern. In early medieval Europe, public baths were tied to Roman culture, and with Rome gone, they carried an air of pagan excess. The Christian church wasn't thrilled about places where naked bodies mingled in steam. Some sermons thundered that bathhouses weren't just unsanitary but outright sinful. And let's be honest, there were a few extracurricular activities happening in those hot chambers, so it wasn't all paranoia. Yet by lumping hygiene together with immorality, leaders helped dismantle an institution that had kept people somewhat cleaner. You picture yourself walking down a street in Paris around the 14th century. There were still bathhouses open, but far fewer, and whispers followed those who entered. Bath attendants were no longer viewed as civic helpers. They were practically accomplices in vice. Historians still argue whether this moral panic was genuine spiritual concern or just a convenient excuse to shut down gathering spots during times of plague. Either way, people began retreating from public bathing, convinced that soap and water could open the body's pores and invite sickness inside. And then the plagues came. You hear coughing in the background, a rattle in the throat of someone leaning against a doorway. Fear spreads faster than the fleas that actually carry disease. Rumors swirl. The baths are breeding grounds. The steam weakens the body. The water itself is cursed. In desperation, cities lock their bathhouses and nail boards across the doors. You glance back at the ruins and realize you're looking at monuments to fear as much as to hygiene. But not everyone gave up so easily. There's a quirky tidbit you catch from an old diary. In 15th century Germany, some towns still held bath parties where people gathered with food, drink, and music in steamy wooden tubs. It was less about getting clean and more about soaking together in merriment. Imagine trying to wash your hair while someone strums a lute next to you. The line between spa day and frat party blurred pretty quickly. Yet the tide was turning. In places like London, officials started warning people that the Thames, already thick with refuse, was safer to drink than to bathe in. You shiver at the idea of wading into that soup. But for many, it seemed safer to stink than to risk sickness. And so, the decline of public bathing became complete. What had once been civic pride now became shameful, suspect, and dangerous. You take a slow breath, catching a whiff of wood smoke as a woman dumps ashes on the street. It hits you that the whole town smells of bodies that haven't seen water in months. People mask it with herbs, with incense, with cloves stuck in oranges. But under it all, there's the persistent funk of unwashed humanity. You wonder how anyone ever flirted successfully in such conditions. Maybe that's why love letters focused so heavily on virtues of the soul. They were trying not to think about the reality of the nose. You spot a group of children darting past, their skin smudged with soot and dirt, their laughter echoing in the alley. They don't know the difference between smelling fresh and smelling human. To them, this is normal. You wonder how different your own childhood memories would be if baths were rare, if soap was unattainable, if water itself was treated with suspicion. And here's the kicker. You lean against a wall, remembering that back in the Islamic world at the same time, public baths remained central to daily life. Cities like Damascus and Istanbul were famous for their hammams, where people not only washed, but also bonded. Cleanliness was tied to spirituality and health. Meanwhile, across much of Christian Europe, the opposite idea took hold. You shake your head because historians still debate why the divergence was so sharp, why one culture clung to water while another recoiled. Politics, religion, economics, they all intertwine in ways that make your head spin. As evening settles, you hear a street musician playing a soft tune, the notes carried on cool air. The melody reminds you of the bathhouse mosaics you saw earlier, of a time when water symbolized community and joy rather than danger. The ruin behind you looks like a ghost of that world, whispering of warm stone benches and cascading fountains. You can almost hear laughter echoing faintly off the crumbling walls. And then you realize you're standing in the gap between two worlds, one that celebrated bathing and one that feared it, and your own skin, dry and sticky from travel, feels like it belongs to neither. You wander away from the silent ruins of those abandoned bathhouses and step into the private quarters of the wealthy, where you quickly realize that for some people, water has been replaced by perfume. Picture a noble woman swishing through a dimly lit hall, her gown heavy with embroidery and her skin practically dripping with rosewater. She hasn't touched a tub in weeks, maybe months, but every inch of fabric and hair is soaked with the scents of cloves, lavender, and a faint edge of musk. You sneeze before you can stop yourself, because frankly, the cloud of fragrance is overwhelming. Perfume becomes her shield, a way to hide what lies beneath. And she's not alone. In courts across Europe, perfume water, scented powders, and sachets of herbs are carried everywhere, tucked into sleeves, tied around belts, hidden in pouches. If you pass close, you might hear the faint rattle of dried rosemary sprigs clinking in little cloth bags. The wealthy dab themselves constantly, convinced that smelling good is the same thing as being clean. You can't help but smile, because you know a spritz of cologne won't fix 3 weeks of sweaty armor. The funny part is that perfume itself wasn't cheap. Just like soap, it was a sign of wealth and access. Distilling rose petals, cinnamon, or ambergris required trade networks stretching across continents. So, when someone walked past smelling of oranges or jasmine, it wasn't just pleasant, it was bragging rights. Historians still argue whether perfume was really about hygiene or about flexing power. Maybe both. Because in a world where actual washing was rare, perfume made the difference between being invited into a room or left outside with the pigs. You notice a quirky tidbit in the corner of a dressing chamber. Powdered gloves. Yes, gloves scented with perfume. Nobles wore them not just to protect their hands, but to leave a trail of fragrance wherever they gestured. Imagine shaking someone's hand and catching a whiff of bergamot from their fingertips. You chuckle, wondering if this was the medieval version of an overzealous co-worker who sprays half a can of body spray in the locker room. But not everyone approved. Doctors warned that too much perfume could corrupt the brain through the nose, filling your head with dangerous vapors. Some clergy grumbled that masking your natural smell was a form of deception. God made you one way, so why try to smell like a rose garden in spring? Still, the upper classes weren't giving up their pomanders and perfumed baths anytime soon. You imagine a bishop scolding a noble, only to pause mid-sermon and sniff the air in envy. Meanwhile, out in the streets, ordinary folk copied what they could. You spot a young apprentice carrying a sprig of mint tied to his belt, chewing on it occasionally to freshen his breath. His clothes reek of sweat and smoke, but the little mint leaf is his attempt at aristocracy. Across the way, a woman hangs laundry over a smoky fire, hoping the smell of burning herbs will cling to the fabric. Soap may be rare, but fragrance, even in its humble forms, becomes a weapon against the human stench that saturates daily life. Perfume, ironically, carried medical weight, too. People believed bad smells caused disease, the miasma theory that foul air spread sickness. So perfumes weren't just luxuries, they were shields against illness. Doctors prescribed fumigating your rooms with juniper or wearing a sachet of dried lavender against the chest. You picture yourself strolling through a plague-stricken town, everyone clutching their pomanders like gas masks, convinced that sniffing cloves would save them. And honestly, you think, maybe it helped a little. At least it calmed their nerves. There's something strangely theatrical about it all. Imagine the layers of clothing, the powdered wigs, the painted faces, all of it topped with a haze of perfume so thick it practically glows in the candlelight. You tilt your head, realizing that in these grand halls, clean is no longer about water at all. It's about illusion, about performance. You can mask the truth of your body as long as your fragrance keeps up the lie. Of course, there's a practical side too. Washing giant gowns made of velvet and brocade? Forget it. You couldn't scrub those in a tub without ruining them, so instead, you sprinkle them with scented powder and call it laundry day. You laugh at the thought of dragging a modern washing machine into the chamber and seeing everyone's jaw drop. And yet, under the humor, there's a sad truth. The divide between rich and poor smells stronger than ever. The noble halls reek of imported perfumes, while the streets outside reek of sweat, mud, and rotting refuse. The scents become social barriers. You smell of roses, you're welcome. You smell of the street, you're shunned. And all the while, the bathhouses crumble quietly behind you, abandoned in the belief that water itself was dangerous. As you step back into the night, the contrast clings to you. The air carries both the stink of humanity and the sweet overlay of spice and flower. It's a strange blend, both comforting and nauseating. You imagine trying to fall asleep in this world with incense burning by your bed, a sprig of rosemary under your pillow, and your skin unwashed for weeks. Maybe you dream of rivers, of rainfall, of water you no longer dare to touch. And you can't help but wonder, when perfume becomes more important than soap, what does clean even mean anymore? You drift from the perfumed chambers back into the cobbled streets, where rumors float through the air heavier than incense smoke. Water itself is a danger. Imagine overhearing a stern-faced physician in a long robe, warning a crowd that hot baths open your pores wide like little doorways, making it easy for disease to stroll in uninvited. Suddenly, the bathhouse doesn't sound like a place of healing. It sounds like a trap. You hear mothers muttering the warning to their children. Don't soak too long. You'll catch the plague. It's the kind of advice repeated so often that people stop questioning it. The irony, of course, is that the real danger isn't from clean water. It's from the filthy, stagnant stuff running through city ditches and sewers. But perception is everything. To the medieval mind, a warm bath is suspicious, indulgent, even risky. You can almost feel the nervous glances each time someone dips a foot in a tub. Historians still argue whether this fear of water was rooted in genuine medical concern or in a convenient excuse for avoiding the effort of bathing. Either way, by the late Middle Ages, caution had hardened into conviction. Bathing could weaken you, thin your blood, sap your strength, and when plague broke out, you were told that scrubbing too much practically invited death. You glance around and realize, in this world, clean might actually get you killed. At least, that's what people believed. A quirky tidbit surfaces from the whispers of a barber surgeon. Some doctors prescribed rubbing yourself with oil or fat instead of bathing, claiming it sealed the pores shut against evil vapors. Picture yourself slathered in goose fat on a hot July afternoon, your skin glistening, your clothes sticking, your dignity slipping away. You laugh softly, realizing that sometimes the cure smelled worse than the supposed disease. Meanwhile, the poor didn't have the luxury of endless debate. They barely had water for cooking, let alone soaking. When they did wash, it was usually a quick splash in a basin, no soap in sight. And the paranoia trickled down, too. If nobles feared tubs, peasants weren't about to risk them either. Instead, they trusted to dry rubs, herbs, and a lot of wishful thinking. The air filled with the mingled odors of sweat and superstition. You pause near a churchyard where a priest preaches that water should be used sparingly. that true purity is of the soul, not the skin. He points to Scripture, weaving a sermon that convinces listeners that scrubbing too often is vanity, maybe even sin. You want to raise your hand and remind him that dirt under the fingernails isn't exactly holy, but you keep quiet. Religion and health are tangled here, and challenging one feels like challenging both. Yet not everyone shunned the tub. In secret, some nobles still indulged. You hear of a queen who kept a private copper tub hidden behind heavy curtains, filling it with scented water on rare occasions. She bathed not to show off, but to soothe herself in private. And when rumors of her secret got out, the court whispered, was she reckless or simply decadent? That's the paradox. You could be judged both for bathing and for not bathing. You sigh, thinking you can't win in a society like this. The streets buzz with gossip. A neighbor fell ill after a bath. Another died after scrubbing too hard. Of course, the truth is likely simpler. Disease was everywhere. But the stories pile up like cautionary tales. A man who skipped his bath survived the plague. A woman who bathed weekly didn't. To a frightened world, these were proof enough. It's almost comical, in a dark way. You imagine standing on the corner selling tickets. Step right up, test your luck. Wash your armpits, and risk eternal doom. And people would actually hesitate. You shake your head, both amused and horrified, because the superstition clung tighter than dirt itself. But then, you stumble across an open scholarly debate from the past. Some physicians argued that cold baths, not hot ones, were safe. Cold water was bracing, closed the pores, and invigorated the body. So while most towns locked away their bathhouses, a few daring souls dunked themselves in rivers, shivering but convinced they were protecting themselves. You imagine the contrast. One camp terrified of tubs, another plunging into icy streams in the name of health. Neither truly knew why plague spread, yet both clung to their watery theories with confidence. As night falls, you sit on a stone bench, the cool air carrying a faint smell of smoke and dung. The world around you is drenched in caution, every act of hygiene weighed against invisible dangers. You can feel the tension in the air, the way people glance nervously at a bucket of water as if it's poison. And you realize how exhausting it must have been, to live in fear not just of disease, but of the very tools that might have helped prevent it. You close your eyes for a moment and think, in a place where soap is rare and water is feared, cleanliness itself becomes an act of bravery or folly. And as you drift deeper into this grimy, suspicious world, you can't help but wonder what strange alternatives people will invent to keep themselves from stinking. You stretch your legs and shuffle along another crooked street, curious about what people do instead of plunging themselves into tubs of risky water. Soon, you discover a patchwork of do-it-yourself cleaning hacks that range from clever to downright bizarre. Imagine walking into a cottage where a family is scraping themselves with coarse sand. No water, no bubbles, just gritty handfuls rubbed over arms and legs, like turning your body into a human frying pan scrub. You can almost hear the scratch, 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 and you wince, wondering if it leaves more scratches than cleanliness. Next, you spot another household dusting themselves with ashes from the fireplace. The fine gray powder sticks to sweaty skin, and when brushed off, it takes some dirt and oils along with it. It's like an early attempt at dry shampoo. Except for the hole, you now smell like last night's burnt stew problem. A little girl giggles as she pats her cheeks with a handful of ashes, pretending it's makeup, while her mother nods in approval. Ash cleansing isn't glamorous, But it's simple, and in a world where soap is taxed to the heavens, it does the trick. Historians still argue whether these folk remedies were truly effective or mostly ritual. Did sand and ash really clean the skin, or was it just the comforting feeling of doing something? You shrug. Maybe both. After all, you've seen people today pay big bucks for exfoliating scrubs that are basically just fancy sand in a tube. Some things never change. A quirky tidbit catches your attention when you overhear an old man boasting about stale bread baths. Yes, people rubbed chunks of hard, dried bread across their bodies, scraping away grime with yesterday's loaf. You imagine standing there, shirtless, scrubbing your chest with an old baguette, and wondering if this is hygiene, or if you've just lost a bet. The old man insists it works, though. You feel cleaner, and you get rid of crumbs in one go. You can't help but chuckle. Cleanliness and breakfast rolled into one. Other households lean on herbs. You watch a woman toss dried lavender and sage into a cloth, tying it into a pouch and rubbing it gently over her arms. The scent masks the smell of sweat, and the slight abrasiveness helps with dirt. Children follow behind her, waving sprigs of rosemary like magic wands, pretending to cast clean spells on one another. It's half hygiene, half theater, and fully charming. Out in the countryside, farmers come up with even rougher tricks. You watch a shepherd use river sand to scrub his hands after tending sheep, the grit digging under his nails. Another worker rinses her hair with sour beer, muttering that it keeps lice away. You wrinkle your nose at the smell, but she swears by it. And when water is scarce or feared, there's always smoke. Families light little bundles of herbs, wafting the smoke over their bodies in a kind of fumigation ritual. The smell clings, the dirt doesn't vanish, but there's a sense of purification all the same. Doctors, of course, had their opinions. Some recommended wiping yourself down with vinegar-soaked cloths, convinced the sharp scent killed harmful vapors. Others swore by sponges dipped in wine, which sounds suspiciously like an excuse to sneak a sip mid-wash. You grin, imagining a doctor telling his patient, "Apply generously to your chest and your throat, just in case." As you walk further, you realize these DIY hacks weren't just about practicality. They were about survival in a taxed, fearful society. Soap was out of reach. Baths were suspect, and so ordinary people cobbled together rituals that gave them some sense of control. You think about how human it is to improvise, to scratch and scrape your way to a feeling of cleanliness, even when resources are scarce. And yet, you can feel the grime in the air. You brush your sleeve against a wall and come away with a smear of soot. You notice the faint itch on your skin, the heaviness in the air, the sour smell of too many unwashed bodies crowded together. Even with sand, ashes, and bread, the stench of the city lingers. The hacks help, but they don't solve the problem. Still, there's something almost admirable about the creativity. People refuse to give up on the idea of clean, even if their methods make you wince. And you can't help but think, when a bar of soap is locked in a chest like treasure, maybe scrubbing yourself with last week's loaf isn't as absurd as it sounds. You smile at the thought, remembering the perfumed nobles and the abandoned bathhouses. Every layer of this society smells different. Roses in the palace, ash in the cottage, vinegar in the sick room. Each scent tells you not just how people cleaned, but how they lived. And as you tuck these details away, you realize you're only just beginning to understand how much effort it took simply to not reek in a world where soap was a luxury and water was mistrusted. You keep walking, curious about how far this obsession with avoiding water and improvising cleanliness could go. And you stumble upon the one thing that ties all these habits together: the government's heavy hand. Soap, already expensive, now climbs even higher because of taxes. You glance at a merchant stall where a bar of soap sits next to scales and ink-stained ledgers. The merchant isn't just selling a bar of cleanliness, he's collecting for the crown too. It hits you that rulers saw soap not as a public good, but as a perfect cash cow. People needed it, but not desperately enough to riot when prices climbed. It was the kind of silent tax that kept the money flowing. In England, for example, soap became so heavily taxed by the 1600s that even the wealthy grumbled. The government licensed only a handful of manufacturers, who then passed costs down to everyone else. You imagine being a servant sent to fetch a single bar and returning with half your week's wages gone. Historians still argue whether soap was chosen because it was easy to control or because rulers genuinely believed cleanliness should be regulated. Either way, it worked. Every bubble produced a profit. You smirk, picturing a royal treasurer saying, "The people may stink, but the coffers smell delightful." A quirky tidbit drifts your way. Tax inspectors sometimes visited soap makers' workshops to ensure they weren't cheating the system. Imagine a man in stiff robes barging into a steamy back room, sniffing suspiciously at vats of boiling fat, dipping his finger in, and declaring, "This smells untaxed." You laugh quietly, because the image is ridiculous, but very real. Soap was treated like contraband tobacco or liquor. The consequences trickled down. Wealthy households stockpiled soap like it was currency, locking bars in cabinets and doling them out sparingly. Ordinary families stretched one small bar across months, shaving off tiny slivers and dissolving them in water to make weak suds. And the poorest, they gave up altogether, leaning fully on sand, ash, or vinegar. Soap became less about hygiene and more about class. If you smelled faintly of olive oil and lavender, people knew you had money. If you didn't, well, they could tell. You pause to watch a soap maker at work. The heat is unbearable, the air thick with the sour tang of lye and fat. His hands are cracked and raw, his apron stiff with stains. He stirs the pot slowly, carefully, because one slip and the whole batch curdles uselessly. Yet even as he sweats, he knows the hardest part isn't the labor. It's paying the taxman who looms at the door. You imagine his muttered curses under his breath, drowned out by the hiss of boiling fat. The ripple effects stretch wider. High taxes stifle innovation. Instead of experimenting with new scents or smoother textures, soap makers churn out the same basic product, focused on survival rather than creativity. And consumers, caught between desire and cost, often choose to stink. You chuckle at the thought. Sorry, I can't afford cleanliness this week. I've got rent to pay. But there's a darker undertone too. Public health collapses when soap becomes too costly. You glance down an alley where children play in the mud, their faces streaked with grime, their clothes stiff with filth. You know that germs, though still invisible to them, are everywhere. Disease thrives, fueled not only by ignorance but also by economic policy. The irony is thick. By taxing soap, rulers made epidemics worse, then turned around and taxed burials when people died. You sigh, realizing that the system was rigged at both ends of life. And yet, some people resisted quietly. Housewives boiled leftover fat and ash to make crude soap at home, risking fines if they were caught. Smugglers brought in bars from abroad, slipping them under loads of grain or wool. A hidden economy of bubbles flourished, and you picture shady dealers whispering, "Hey, need a bar? Fresh from Marseille, no tax, No questions. It's almost funny, imagining a cloak and dagger trade built entirely around soap. Still, the official line prevailed. Soap was a revenue stream, not a necessity. And society adjusted. People washed less, smelled worse, and shrugged more. The wealthy leaned harder on perfume, the poor leaned harder on hacks, and the middle tried to stretch what little they could afford. You take a deep breath, though the air isn't kind to your lungs, and reflect on how something so simple became so political. A bar of soap wasn't just about cleaning your skin. It was about paying your dues, proving your status, and navigating a world where even hygiene had a price tag. You run your thumb across your palm, imagining the slick, sudsy lather you're used to, and realize just how foreign that luxury would feel here. As you move along, you can almost hear the faint clink of coins echoing with every bubble that never formed, every hand unwashed, every disease that spread because rulers found profit in grime. And you can't help but chuckle bitterly. In this world, cleanliness really wasn't next to godliness. It was next to taxation. You keep drifting through the streets, and your nose wrinkles before your brain even catches up. Something foul is in the air. It takes only a moment to realize it's not one specific thing. It's everything. The whole city carries a sour musk of sweat, unwashed bodies, animal dung, smoke, and food that's been aged a little too long. You step carefully past a puddle that's suspiciously dark and sticky, and you wonder whether it's spilled ale or something much less festive. You realize that smells weren't just background noise in these times. They were conversation starters, social signals, even class markers. If someone reeked of rose oil, you knew they had money. If someone smelled like garlic, tallow, and yesterday's sweat, you knew they didn't. It was a hierarchy built on scent, and you couldn't escape it because the air was too thick with evidence. One mainstream fact comes to mind. In many European towns, laws actually regulated waste disposal, but enforcement was another story. Officially, you weren't supposed to dump chamber pots into the street. Unofficially, people did it anyway, sometimes even yelling, "Gardes l'eau," watch out for the water, before flinging contents from a window. You duck instinctively, as if you might get splashed, even though it's only a memory drifting on the air. The quirky side hits when you remember that perfumes weren't just about covering stench. They were believed to protect you. Physicians warned that foul odors carried disease, so people carried pomanders, little metal balls filled with herbs, spices, or even vinegar-soaked sponges. You picture yourself walking around with a tiny apple-sized cage dangling from your belt, sniffing it like a nervous tick every few minutes. It's oddly charming, but also proof that even accessories were weaponized against the ever-present funk. Historians still argue whether most people were actually nose-blind to their own smell, or if they complained as much as modern visitors would. Some suggest they adapted. Your body just stops noticing. Others insist chronic complaints about stench of the city prove people were painfully aware. You tilt your head, deciding it was probably both. People grumbled about it, but they also shrugged, the way you shrug at a traffic jam now. You pause near a bakery, expecting some relief. And yes, the warm aroma of bread drifts out, comforting and rich. But just as quickly, it's overwhelmed by the tannery down the street, where hides soak in urine and dung to soften them. The stench claws into your throat, and you gag. You realize that towns were patchworks of competing odors, like a twisted version of aromatherapy. Fresh loaves, horse droppings, burning pitch, unwashed flesh. Take a deep breath, and congratulations. You've just had the full medieval spa experience. Humor creeps in because you can't help but imagine medieval pickup lines. Forget you smell nice. It would be more like, "Ah, your lavender pouch masks the dung so delightfully." Or maybe, "You're less pungent than the rest. Shall we dance?" You laugh quietly, because romance really had to fight hard against the nose. But the smellscape wasn't just urban. In villages, barns stood right next to cottages, animals sheltered inside during winters, and floors were strewn with straw that soaked up everything, good and bad. You picture a family eating stew while a cow shifts in the corner, swatting flies with its tail. Cozy, yes, but fragrant in ways no candle could conquer. One surprising detail you didn't expect. In some places, churches were praised for their smells. Incense, beeswax, and fresh greenery set them apart as sanctuaries of relative freshness. People lingered partly because prayer was holy, and partly because their noses got a rare break. Imagine slipping into Mass and whispering to yourself, "Thank heaven," for the scent alone. You notice that, oddly enough, smell became tied to morality. Bad smells meant sin or decay. Pleasant ones meant purity. A saint's corpse that supposedly didn't stink was considered proof of holiness. You shake your head, amused, because even after death, your aroma was your resume. Still, you can't shake the heavy air pressing on your senses. Every step reminds you that cleanliness wasn't just about health. It was about surviving the olfactory assault of daily life. And while people got used to it, you can tell they never fully escaped it. Some coped with jokes, some with herbs, and some with sheer endurance. You take one last deep inhale, regretting it instantly, but it helps fix the lesson in your mind. The past was not scented like rose gardens and pine forests. It was a soup of smells, layered and shifting, a reminder that every breath carried history. And as you exhale, you whisper to yourself with a grin, "No wonder perfume was a bestseller." You wander farther, and it strikes you how survival in this world wasn't about vitamins or gym routines. It was about tricks, shortcuts, and hacks for keeping yourself just barely clean enough to avoid scandal. Soap was expensive, baths were rare, and water was often filthy, so people leaned on anything they could find to cheat the system. You see a woman standing by her doorway, rubbing vinegar across her face with a rag. The smell is sharp, but her skin does look less greasy afterward. Vinegar wasn't just for salad. People swore it tightened pores, killed smells, and warded off disease. You try dabbing a little on your own hand, and sure enough, you smell like an aggressive pickle, but at least not like sweat. A mainstream fact drifts into your thoughts. Ash and sand were common cleansers. Mixed with water, they created a gritty paste that scrubbed dirt away. Imagine brushing your teeth with a handful of ashes and rinsing with beer because the water would make you sick. Your smile might sparkle less than a toothpaste commercial, but hey, no plaque is better than no teeth. Then comes the quirky gem. Crocodile dung. Yes, really. Some ancient beauty routines used it as a paste for skincare, or even as an early form of birth control. You can't help but laugh nervously, imagining someone carefully applying a fresh smear and thinking, "Ah, natural and effective." You wrinkle your nose at the idea, but it shows the lengths people went to when trying to avoid water and soap. Historians still argue whether people actually believed these tricks worked, or if they were just passing down habits out of desperation. Some say vinegar and ash genuinely helped. Others insist it was superstition wrapped in daily routine. You shrug, because either way, it It gave people a sense of control in a world where filth seemed impossible to beat. You glance into another home and spot laundry strung across a smoky hearth. Clothes were rarely washed fully. Instead, people sprinkled them with scented herbs or brushed them with stale bread to lift dirt. Yes, bread. You chuckle at the sight of a man carefully rubbing a hard crust across his doublet, muttering as crumbs fall to the floor. It's budget dry cleaning, medieval edition. Perfume, of course, was the luxury hack. A dab of rose oil on your wrists, some lavender sachets in your sleeves, maybe even a perfumed glove if you were rich enough. It didn't stop the grime underneath, but it distracted noses long enough to pass in polite company. You smirk because it feels a little like spraying deodorant over yesterday's workout clothes, effective until someone stands too close. For hair, people dusted their scalps with powders to soak up oil, then combed it out. The powders could be made of flour, starch, or even crushed flowers. You picture yourself shaking your head like a human cupcake, white powder puffing out in little clouds every time you move. Practical? Maybe. Ridiculous looking? Definitely. And then there were talismans. People hung garlic cloves, carried little packets of herbs, or wore amulets shaped like hands or crosses. The logic was simple. If disease traveled through bad air, surround yourself with strong smells or holy symbols to keep it away. You grin at the mental picture of a man reeking of onions, proudly convinced he's safe from the plague. You also notice the physical hacks, scraping dirt off with knives, rubbing with rough cloths, or scouring skin with pumice stones. It wasn't relaxing. It was borderline painful. You watch as a farmer drags a rag across his arm, wincing as it scrapes, then shrugs like it's nothing. You imagine him saying, "Beauty is pain," centuries before the phrase was ever coined. Still, you sense the deeper truth. These hacks weren't just about hygiene. They were survival strategies in a world where real cleanliness was priced out, taxed, or simply unavailable. People improvised because they had no choice. And while you might laugh at dung masks or bread scrubbing, you also admire the stubborn creativity behind it all. You step away from the smoky cottage, the air thick with vinegar, herbs, and faint animal musk, and you realize something important. Even in filth, people wanted dignity. Even when soap was a luxury, they looked for ways to smell better, look cleaner, and feel human. It's a reminder that, across centuries, vanity and survival often walked hand in hand. You exhale slowly, shaking your head with a grin. "So," you murmur to yourself, "if tomorrow's skincare trend includes ashes, vinegar, and a little bread rubbing, I guess we're just getting back to our roots." You press onward, and the mood shifts. The streets narrow, shadows stretch across crooked cobblestones, and whispers of sickness trail in the air. You realize that all this half-hearted washing, all the perfumed patches and vinegar tricks, carried a much darker price. Disease thrived here, creeping through every household, every alley, every bed. The mainstream fact hits first. Europe's infamous plagues weren't just about fleas or bad luck. They spread faster because people rarely washed and had little access to true sanitation. Rats scuttled freely, waste piled up, and bodies brushed against one another in markets where soap was too costly to waste. You can almost feel a flea crawling up your leg as you think about it, and you shudder. Then the quirky detail emerges. During outbreaks, some doctors recommended bathing less, not more. They believed water opened pores and let in the miasma, the poisonous air of disease. Imagine being feverish, begging for relief, and your physician sternly ordering, "No water, rub on more herbs, and pray. You shake your head, equal parts horrified and amused. Historians still argue whether hygiene really played the leading role in spreading epidemics, or whether larger forces, climate, trade, sheer bad luck, were to blame. Some insist filthy living conditions made plagues inevitable. Others argue that even clean cities of the time would have suffered. The debate doesn't comfort you. Either way, you're standing in the middle of an outbreak waiting to happen. You picture how smells and sickness blended. When someone coughed, neighbors flinched, not just from the sound but from the odor, assuming disease traveled through the stench. People burned pitch, rosemary, or juniper in their homes, choking themselves with smoke in the hope it purified the air. You cough, just imagining it, your throat burning with invisible fumes. The fear wasn't abstract. You turn a corner and see red crosses painted on doors, signs that sickness lurks within. Families trapped inside, quarantined by neighbors who toss bread through windows rather than risk opening the door. You imagine the claustrophobia, the silence broken only by coughing fits, and your chest tightens. Meanwhile, cemeteries expand. Digging crews work day and night, unable to keep pace with the demand. And yes, even burials were taxed, so dying became another financial burden. You grimace, because it feels like the ultimate insult. You couldn't afford soap to stay clean, and now your family can barely afford to put you in the ground. And yet, through all this horror, small acts of resilience shine. A mother boils vinegar to wash her child's hands, insisting it will protect him. A priest sprinkles holy water in sick rooms, offering comfort, even if not cure. A perfumer concocts new scents, selling hope in tiny bottles. You realize that survival wasn't just physical, it was psychological. People needed to believe these hacks could help, even if evidence was thin. You chuckle darkly, because it all sounds so familiar. In your world, too, people sell miracle cures, strange diets, and scented gadgets in the face of fear. Centuries pass, but the pattern holds. When knowledge is scarce, hope smells like rosemary and vinegar. As you step away from the painted doors, your shoulders slump with the weight of history. Disease didn't just haunt these people. It defined how they lived, how they cleaned, how they taxed, how they prayed. And while you're glad your world has antibiotics and hand sanitizer, you can't shake the eerie truth. Their struggle was raw, constant, and only a heartbeat away from your own. You whisper, almost as if to reassure yourself, "Remember, don't open the pores," and then laugh softly at the absurdity. But deep down, you understand. Behind the joke lies centuries of fear, woven into every unwashed hand and every breath of stale air. You wander past the painted doors and find yourself in the marketplace, where chatter mixes with clinking coins, and you notice how strangely proud people seem of their unwashed state. It wasn't just necessity, it became an identity. You lean in, listening to a merchant boasting about how he hasn't bathed in months, as though it's proof of his toughness. And you realize dirt wasn't always shameful. Sometimes it was a badge of honor. The mainstream fact surfaces first. Medieval laborers often wore grime like a uniform. A farmer's hands were cracked and soil-caked, proof that he worked hard. A blacksmith's soot-covered face was a sign of skill. Cleanliness, ironically, sometimes marked you as soft, idle, or even suspicious. In certain communities, being spotless meant you weren't doing your share. You smirk, imagining a villager side-eyeing you for being too clean, whispering, "Clearly not one of us." The quirky detail adds some spice. In France, there was once a superstition that washing too often would wash away your strength. People genuinely believed baths could weaken bones or invite dangerous humors into the body. You chuckle, because it's almost like saying, "Sorry, can't bathe today. I've got to keep my muscles strong." It sounds like a lazy excuse, but it was taken seriously. Historians still argue whether this pride in filth was truly universal or just a byproduct of poverty. Some claim peasants simply couldn't afford soap, so they reframed dirt as natural. Others think there was genuine cultural pride in looking earthy. You tilt your head, deciding it was probably both. A little spin to make hardship feel like choice. You pause near a group of nobles, and the contrast makes you grin. While peasants showed off their grime, the elite flaunted perfumes and ornate clothing, carefully hiding the same lack of baths under layers of finery. Yet even they sometimes boasted of not wasting time on washing. A nobleman might sneer, "I'm too busy with affairs of state to scrub my feet." Dirt, oddly enough, was democratic. It clung to everyone, just styled differently. But pride in filth went deeper. For soldiers, stinking was a weapon. There are accounts of men believing their odor intimidated enemies, like a musk of battle readiness. You can't help but laugh, imagining a knight lifting his arm mid-fight and his opponent fainting, not from the sword, but from the smell. Even religion played a role. Some holy figures wore their filth as proof of humility, rejecting worldly vanity. Pilgrims trudged for months without washing, seeing their grime as sacred. You picture a barefoot monk with a beard tangled in crumbs and sweat stains on his robe, smiling serenely because his stink was closer to God than perfume could ever be. The strange thing is, pride and filth also shaped social interactions. People compared odors the way you might compare colognes now. "Ah, you smell of the fields," someone might say approvingly, or less kindly, "You reek like a fishmonger." It was banter, but it reinforced identity. Smell became shorthand for who you were and what you did. Still, not everyone bought into the pride. Some quietly longed for soap, water, and relief, sneaking vinegar washes when they could. But the louder voices framed dirt as virtue, especially among the poor, because it made hardship seem like strength rather than defeat. You can almost hear the slogans, "Real men don't bathe," "A little mud builds character," and you laugh, realizing those lines wouldn't sound out of place in a modern locker room. As you move on, the marketplace air thick with sweat and smoke, you feel a peculiar respect. These people didn't just endure filth, they reframed it, turned it into pride, even status. You wrinkle your nose, but you also smile. In a way, they won. They found dignity in stink, and that's something even the highest tax collector couldn't strip away. You whisper to yourself, "Smell like victory," and chuckle softly, knowing the phrase has never been truer than here. You leave the noisy marketplace and wander into a quieter part of town, where the houses lean in close together and shadows curl at the edges of narrow alleys. Here, filth takes on another meaning. It isn't just survival or pride, it's reputation. People talk about each other's smells and habits, the way modern gossip columns talk about fashion disasters. You pause to listen, and you realize that in this world, hygiene, or lack of it, was social currency. The mainstream fact stands clear. In many communities, smell was a class signal. Nobles cloaked themselves in rose oil and musk, while peasants smelled of soil, sweat, and animals. This wasn't just biology. It was branding. Your odor told others where you belonged. Step into the wrong space, smelling too strongly of dung, and people would assume you didn't belong at all. You imagine someone whispering at a feast, "Don't seat him near the roast goose. He'll overpower it." The quirky tidbit slips in with a grin. Some cities actually hired professional smellers to detect quality or fraud. Perfume merchants, soap makers, even winemakers sometimes had specialists sniff the product and vouch for its worth. You laugh softly, picturing a man in fancy sleeves leaning over a stranger's armpit and declaring, "Yes, definitely goat. Pay no more than 2 pence. What a job to put on a resume." Historians still argue whether gossip about smell was exaggerated by writers or truly central to everyday life. Some claim odor was the first thing people judged. Others say it was clothing or speech. You tilt your head, deciding smell probably came first. You couldn't hide it, no matter what you wore or said. You pass a group of women at a well, trading news. One leans close, whispering that the butcher's wife smells of cloves, which means she must be spending money on perfume she can't afford. Another snorts, claiming the miller's apprentice reeks like ale because he drinks more than he grinds. These exchanges aren't about hygiene, they're about power. A single rumor about smell could stain someone's reputation, the same way a scandal might today. And then, there's the romantic angle. Courtship was steeped in scent. A suitor who arrived smelling faintly of lavender or rosemary seemed more appealing. One who smelled like sheep pen and garlic soup? Not so much. You grin at the image of medieval flirting. Your hands are calloused, your hair is unwashed, but your rose oil lingers like a dream. You can't help but laugh, because love really had to fight its battles nose first. Even religion joined in. Priests warned against vanity perfumes, reminding people that inner purity mattered more than outer aroma. Yet churches themselves burned incense, filling the air with holy fragrance. It sent a message. The divine smelled good. The sinful reeked. The irony makes you chuckle. God loved a good scent as much as anyone. But social odor worked both ways. The elite might gossip about peasants, but peasants noticed the elite too. They muttered about nobles who stank of rot beneath their silks, because fine clothes couldn't always mask bad health. Smell became a weapon in class warfare, each side using the nose to judge and condemn. And then, of course, came the inevitable scandals. A noble family might be mocked because their castle reeked of stagnant moat water. A merchant could lose customers if rumors spread that his soap smelled faintly of rancid fat. One barmaid could earn or lose her tips depending on whether patrons whispered she smelled sweet or sour. You realize gossip was sticky, and once an odor story clung to you, it was hard to scrub away. As you step through the alley, the mixture of smoke, sweat, and herbs wrapping around you, you can't help but think of your own world. Don't we do the same? We trade stories about who smells nice, who overdid the cologne, who needs a shower. Scent still signals identity, even if we don't admit it. The difference is, now you can fix it with a 10-minute shower. Back then, you lived with it, or used it to your advantage. You smile, shaking your head. Reputation wasn't just about what you wore, how you spoke, or who you knew. It was about what you smelled like when you walked into a room. And in that sense, every nose was a judge, jury, and gossip columnist rolled into one. You push past the gossiping alley and find yourself drifting into the realm of rituals and superstitions where cleaning isn't just about looking presentable, it's about warding off danger, spirits, and bad luck. In a world where science was half whisper, half mystery, people treated hygiene as both medicine and magic. The mainstream fact comes first. Religious rituals often involved water, but not for scrubbing the way you'd imagine. Holy water sprinkled over foreheads, baptismal baths, or ritual foot washings were less about hygiene and more about symbolism. You watch as a priest dips a branch into a bowl, shaking droplets across a crowd, the people lifting their faces not for cleanliness, but for blessing. Washing became sacred theater, not daily routine. Then comes the quirky bit. Some households believed spitting on a baby protected it from evil spirits. Not bathing the child, mind you. Spitting. You cringe at the thought of aunties leaning in lovingly with a little patoo to guard against curses. It's both revolting and oddly tender, a reminder that people grasped at any ritual that promised safety. Historians still argue whether people genuinely believed these rituals worked, or if they performed them mainly for tradition. Some say faith in these acts was absolute. Others suggest it was more like a safety net. You might not believe it, but why risk skipping it? You nod to yourself, because that logic feels timeless. You glance into a home and spot bundles of herbs hanging from beams. Rosemary, sage, lavender. They aren't just deodorants. They're talismans, meant to cleanse the air and scare away disease. When the plague came, people stuffed herbs into masks, burned them in rooms, or wore them in pouches tied to their belts. The ritual of smelling something strong became a daily prayer. Superstition stretched into the bathhouse, too. Some said water could wash away not only dirt, but luck itself. Bath too close to a wedding, and you might scrub away fertility. Bathe during certain moon phases, and you could invite misfortune. You chuckle softly at the image of someone saying, "Sorry, can't wash tonight. It's a waning crescent. I'll risk a curse if I do." And of course, cleanliness had heavenly PR. Saints' relics were said to smell sweet, proof of holiness. Corpses that resisted decay became incorruptible, a sign of divine favor. Even death had its scent rituals, and you feel a shiver at the idea that perfume wasn't just about beauty. It was about signaling God's touch. You also catch whispers of stranger practices. Some people rubbed themselves with bread and then fed it to dogs, believing the dirt would leave their bodies through the crust. Others washed only on specific feast days, treating the act like a holy reset button. You smirk, picturing someone saying, "Don't worry, I'll be clean by Easter." But beneath the oddities lies a thread of comfort. These rituals gave people a sense of control in a filthy, uncertain world. Whether sprinkling vinegar, hanging herbs, or chanting prayers while rinsing their feet, they weren't just cleaning. They were negotiating with fate. You admire that determination, even as you wrinkle your nose at the thought of spittle blessings. The air around you smells faintly of sage smoke now, curling in soft spirals from a nearby cottage. It feels both soothing and eerie, like walking through a half-church, half-apothecary. You take a slow breath, letting it settle in your chest, and realize why people clung so fiercely to these rituals. They weren't just practical. They were emotional anchors in a world where death lingered in every corner. You smile to yourself, whispering, "A little spit, a little sage, a little faith." And you laugh quietly, because as strange as it sounds, it worked. For the soul, if not the skin. You wander onward, brushing past bundles of herbs still smoldering in doorways, and you stumble into another peculiar corner of history. How monarchs, nobles, and the wealthy elite performed hygiene. Or rather, how they didn't. Because when you live in a palace, it's amazing how rarely anyone actually bothers with soap and water. You notice a velvet-draped chamber pot tucked in a golden alcove, and that's your first clue. Cleanliness for the rich often meant perfumes, powders, and an army of servants to tidy up the mess behind the scenes. In fact, mainstream fact, King Louis XIV of France reportedly took only 2 or 3 full baths in his entire life. Instead, he drenched himself in cologne and insisted on clean linens daily, believing fresh fabric touching his skin drew out impurities. You imagine him strutting through Versailles smelling like a walking citrus grove, sheets fluttering like banners of supposed cleanliness. Then the quirky tidbit. Queen Elizabeth I supposedly relied on perfumes and wigs to cover the smells that lingered from infrequent bathing. Her teeth were said to be blackened from sugar, her gowns layered so thickly they rarely got laundered, and yet she dazzled her court with powdered skin and carefully staged appearances. You can't help but joke that medieval deodorant was essentially hope and sequins. Historians still argue whether elites truly avoided baths entirely, or if they occasionally indulged in discreet private soakings that never made it into records. Some accounts describe ornate bathtubs dragged into royal chambers, lined with linen, scented with herbs. But the gossip-loving chroniclers of the day didn't always care to write down a quiet Tuesday bath. After all, perfume scandals sold better. You peer deeper into a palace dressing room, where trays of rosewater and vinegar bottles are lined like jewels. Servants sprinkle their masters with scented drops, pat their faces with cloths, and change shirts again and again. For nobles, clean meant never wearing the same sweaty outfit twice. Laundry was the real hygiene, even if your body never saw soap. And let's not forget the wigs. Aristocrats powdered them so heavily that clouds of flour hung in the air. Some hid lice colonies beneath elaborate curls, scratching discreetly with golden picks. You chuckle at the thought of an 18th century ball where everyone looked regal, but sounded like a chorus of rustling fingernails. Even funerals got the luxury treatment. When nobles died, they were embalmed with spices and oils, sealed in ornate coffins, and paraded through towns. The poor decomposed quickly in churchyards, but elites lingered in perfumed grandeur. You tilt your head, realizing even death had a class divide in its smells. And yet, the illusion worked. Courtiers praised their monarchs for their freshness, mistaking perfume for purity. Commoners crowded to catch a whiff of royalty, perhaps believing it smelled like heaven itself. You can't resist a sly grin. If only they knew it was just vinegar and lavender hiding a month's worth of sweat. Of course, even palaces weren't immune to filth. Versailles famously lacked adequate toilets for years, and guests relieved themselves in stairwells or gardens. You picture powdered nobles swanning through marble halls, delicately stepping around little surprises. The palace of the Sun King, shining with mirrors and chandeliers, still reeked faintly of human reality. And here's the irony. While peasants sometimes washed in rivers, kings wrapped themselves in linen and rose water, avoiding water like it was poison. Who was really cleaner? It's the sort of thought that makes you smirk as you wander through golden corridors, wondering if history's unclean masses sometimes had fresher skin than the perfumed elite. Still, you admire the ingenuity. Without modern soap or showers, nobles turned fashion itself into hygiene. Layers of cloth, powders, and scents became their armor, their illusion of control. It worked well enough that courtiers kept bowing, poets kept praising, and kings kept strutting. You take a last glance at the silk-draped chambers, smile wryly, and whisper, "Royal hygiene. Cleaner sheets, not cleaner skin." Then you drift on, letting the laughter fade into the powdered air. You leave behind the powdered wigs and perfumed linens of the palace, and your path bends toward the practical world of coins, contracts, and numbers. Here, cleanliness and death themselves get tangled up in the strangest of economic knots, where the cost of surviving or not surviving could drain a purse faster than a thief in a candlelit alley. The mainstream fact to ground you: in many cities, taxes were levied on soap, making something as simple as washing your hands a matter of wealth. In England, the infamous soap tax lingered for more than a century, with strict rules that limited how much soap was produced and who could buy it. Imagine having to budget for cleanliness the way you now budget for rent. For the poor, soap became a luxury good, while the rich stacked bars like they were storing gold. Then, the quirky tidbit. In some towns, gravediggers charged extra for carrying the coffin the long way around churchyards to avoid cursed plots. If you couldn't afford the fee, your loved one might be laid to rest in the shadowed, less desirable corner of consecrated ground. Death had an upgrade menu, like some grim medieval version of a video game store. Historians still argue whether the poor truly resisted cleanliness out of belief, thinking water weakened the body, or if it was simply economics. When soap is taxed and laundry costs a day's wages, you don't skip baths because you hate water. You skip them because you're broke. Poverty shaped hygiene more than philosophy ever did. You glance around and see market stalls offering little luxuries: a pinch of soap flakes wrapped in paper, bottles of vinegar, sprigs of lavender. But prices are steep. A washerwoman explains that nobles pay for endless linens while she reuses her one dress for weeks, scrubbing only the dirtiest patches. Soap taxes, she mutters, are for gentlemen's pockets, not ours. And death? That's even more expensive. Coffins, burial fees, candles for vigils, tolling the church bell, all had their price. The poor often pooled together coins to bury a family member, while the very poorest might be interred in common pits. You wince at the thought. Death didn't release you from debt. Sometimes it doubled it. Even mourning had tears. Rich families commissioned elaborate black garments, silver-trimmed coffins, and months of church services. The poor were expected to grieve quietly in patched clothes, with no fanfare. Imagine weeping for someone you loved, while envying the wealthy procession rolling past. Horses draped in velvet, trumpets announcing their grief. The economy even shaped how bodies smelled. Nobles bought perfumes and oils to mask decay, while poorer families relied on herbs, quick burials, or simply endured. And you think to yourself, all the powders and perfumes in Versailles couldn't erase the universal truth. Everybody rotted the same in the end. And yet, humor sneaks in. You overhear a man grumble that he's too poor to die properly. Another jokes that soap is for people who want their skin to be as broke as their wallets. Even in the tightest corners of history, laughter found a way to survive. It's hard not to notice the irony. The state taxed cleanliness while pestilence swept through streets, and priests charged for burials even as churchyards overflowed. You tilt your head and whisper, imagine paying extra just to be allowed to smell less terrible. That, right there, is history's running gag. Still, you can't help but feel a quiet respect for those who endured. They stretched coins, found substitutes, and leaned on rituals when money failed. They hung herbs instead of burning incense, washed in rivers instead of buying taxed soap, and carried their dead with dignity, even when coffins were beyond reach. You take a step back, watching the bustle of a marketplace where every coin decides whether you'll be clean or stink, honored or forgotten. It's sobering, and yet you smile faintly, murmuring, "Cleanliness might have been next to godliness, but only if you could afford it." You leave the crowded marketplace behind and drift toward the twilight edges of the city, where time itself begins to dissolve. The streets grow quieter, the shadows longer, and you realize you've reached the place where history winds down. Not with a bang, but with a sigh. Here you gather the last pieces of the story, how people balanced survival, ritual, and the high cost of simply existing. The mainstream fact anchors you first. By the late 19th century, public health reforms finally began to tackle centuries of neglect. Cities installed sewage systems. Soap production was deregulated in England after 1853, and water supplies were gradually made cleaner. The state shifted from taxing soap to encouraging hygiene, a dramatic pivot that transformed survival rates. Imagine the relief of finally being able to wash your hands without worrying whether the act would bankrupt you. Then the quirky tidbit. Some Victorians, still wary of bathing too often, turned to dry baths, made of flour, bran, or even powdered starch. They would dust themselves like pastries, claiming it absorbed sweat and odor. You can't resist a sleepy laugh at the image of someone literally breading themselves like fried chicken in the name of hygiene. Historians still argue whether this shift in cleanliness came purely from science, germ theory, statistics, the booming field of medicine, or whether public pressure, driven by urban stink and scandal, forced governments to act. Perhaps it was both. Progress, like soap lather, tends to build up slowly until it spills over. And yet, despite reforms, one truth remained. Dying was still expensive. Coffins, headstones, burial plots, and rituals continued to carry price tags. Cemeteries became businesses, funeral parlors thrived, and mourning outfits were sold in department stores. Death had become professionalized, commodified, dressed in silk. You whisper to yourself, even the grave comes with a receipt. But something else lingered too. Memory. People began to see hygiene not only as survival, but as dignity. To bathe, to bury, to perfume, to mourn. It was all about showing respect for the living and the dead alike. Soap was no longer just a bar. It became a symbol of modernity, a little rectangle of hope that the future could smell better than the past. You smile softly at the thought. From spit blessings and perfumed wigs to taxed soap and costly graves, you've wandered through centuries where people struggled to make peace with dirt, disease, and death. And through it all, humor, ritual, and resilience carried them forward. The air grows cooler now, the city fading into stillness. You feel the weight of the stories settle like a quilt across your shoulders, comforting in their strangeness. And as you stand at the edge of history's long corridor, you prepare to let go. The night air is softer now, the streets behind you fading like candle smoke. You've walked through centuries of soap taxes and perfumed wigs, of rituals whispered in shadows, and laughter tucked into market stalls. And now, here, at the end, everything slows. The clatter of coins, the murmurs of priests, the rustle of linens, all drift into silence. You breathe more slowly. The stories settle into place, like old books finally returned to their shelves. Even the oddest bits, the flower baths, the spit blessings, the fear of unlucky moonlit baths, become strangely tender when you think about them now. They were ways of coping, of finding comfort in a world that didn't make it easy to be clean, or dignified, or even alive. Let the imagery soften. The sharp scent of vinegar becomes a whisper of lavender. The echo of bells becomes a faint lull, and the heavy doors of the past close quietly behind you. There is no rush, just the long exhale of history fading into rest. You might notice your own breathing, slower now, your shoulders loosening as if centuries of soap taxes and costly burials no longer belong to you. They belong to the past, and the past can rest. Tonight, you can too. So allow yourself to drift. Imagine clean linen settling over you like soft clouds, the hum of distant voices fading into silence, and the world outside growing quieter with every passing second. And as your eyes grow heavier, remember this. History is strange, funny, sometimes uncomfortable, but always human. And being human means eventually, you let yourself rest. Sleep well, dream gently, and let the night carry you safely forward.